My name is Claire Bennett. I am 32 years old, and I always thought Christmas was about family warmth and belonging. I was the daughter who sent money home every month, the sister who picked up the pieces, the one they could always count on. So when I walked into a holiday potluck and heard by accident that my parents had thrown a Christmas party without even telling me, something inside me cracked. Why was I the easiest one to erase after all I had given? And what would happen once I finally chose not to be silent anymore? Stay with me, because this Christmas turned into a story no one in my family will ever forget. Let me take you back to where it began. It was one of those New England Decembers where the cold had settled in deep, the kind that made your breath look like smoke, even in the middle of the afternoon. I had driven out to Worcester to join my mother's side of the family for what was supposed to be a casual Christmas potluck. My aunt's backyard was strung with lights, a fire pit was blazing, and the folding tables were loaded with crock-pots, foil pans, and enough pies to feed the whole block. Kids were running around with red cheeks, someone had set up a Bluetooth speaker, blasting Mariah Carey, and the adults had already started pouring spiked eggnog into plastic cups. I balanced a paper plate with ham slices and macaroni salad, trying to find a spot near the buffet where I wouldn't be in the way. Jenny, my cousin, came over with a candy cane in one hand and her phone in the other. She was laughing at something on the screen, hair falling into her face. Without looking up, she said brightly, "So did you have a good time at your parents' Christmas party last night?" For a second, I thought she was joking. I blinked at her. "What party?" She finally looked up, confused by my expression, and then let out a quick laugh like she had caught me teasing. "The party at your parents' place, Claire. Don't tell me you skipped it." The words sank in slowly, heavier than the fork in my hand. I forced a smile that didn't feel right on my face, and mumbled something about needing to grab another napkin. My stomach tightened as I set the plate down, the macaroni wobbling under the plastic. Around me, people were laughing, clinking cups, children screaming by the swing set. Everything looked normal except for the strange ringing in my ears. I slipped through the kitchen door into the hallway, heart beating faster, and found a quiet corner near the coat rack. My hands shook as I dug my phone from my bag. No missed calls, no texts, nothing that said party, nothing that even hinted at it. I pressed my palms against my thighs, trying to steady myself. It wasn't that I needed an invitation to know I belonged. It was that they hadn't thought I did. From the dining room window, I could see my mother in her pale blue cardigan, the one she wore every holiday, talking to Aunt Carol, with her usual calm smile. She looked composed, graceful, as if the world was exactly how it should be. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it hard to breathe. Jenny came back through the kitchen a few minutes later, holding a gingerbread cookie. She waved casually before drifting toward the fire pit outside, completely unaware of the silence that had dropped over me. I pulled on my coat and scarf and slipped out the front door. The cold slapped me awake, but it didn't stop the ache sitting in my chest. My car was parked at the end of the driveway, already dusted with a thin layer of frost. I climbed inside, shut the door, and sat with the engine off. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window, eyes wide and wet. I pressed my head against the steering wheel and tried to steady my breathing. Hurt, angry, tired, it was all tangled together. The last Christmas I remembered with my father before he passed, he had insisted we all sit around the piano while he played carols off key, laughing when we rolled our eyes. I had thought family was unshakable then. Now, years later, it felt like I had been erased without anyone even noticing. The voices from the backyard carried faintly through the cold. More laughter, someone shouting about burning marshmallows. My phone buzzed once, a random promotional email, and then went silent again. I let it fall into my lap. I sat there in the dark for a long time before I started the car, the heater blasting against my frozen fingers. My face felt hot, though my eyes burning. I didn't know what hurt more, that they had planned a Christmas without me, or that no one seemed surprised I wasn't there. The drive back to my apartment in Brookline felt longer than usual. Streetlights cast yellow circles on the wet pavement, Christmas wreaths hung on lampposts, and houses glowed with strings of colored bulbs. Each cheerful display made me feel more alone. By the time I pulled into my complex, the anger had faded into a dull heaviness. Inside, I tossed my coat on the chair and kicked off my boots. The apartment smelled faintly of pine from the small fake tree in the corner. I had decorated it half-heartedly a week earlier only because Maddie had texted a photo of the one in her dorm, and I didn't want to admit I hadn't bothered. I sank onto the couch staring at the blinking lights. My phone sat on the coffee table face down. I reached for it once, twice, then pulled my hand back. If I called my mother now, she would tell me I was being dramatic. That word always felt like a slap, the same one she used when I cried at my father's funeral, the same one when I called her after I lost my job 5 years ago. Don't be dramatic, Claire. You'll land on your feet. The memory tightened my chest again. I stood and paced the room, the sound of my socks dragging on the wood floor filling the silence. Finally, I grabbed the phone, my thumb hovering over her number. My reflection in the black screen looked tired. The kind of tired that didn't go away with sleep. I pressed call. The line rang twice before her familiar voice picked up warm but brisk, the one she used with store clerks. Hi, honey. Everything all right? My mouth went dry, but I forced the words out anyway. Mom, did you have a Christmas party last night? There was a pause, the sound of a refrigerator door closing in the background. Well, yes, actually. Why do you ask? I gripped the phone tighter. No one told me. She chuckled softly. Oh, Claire, don't make this a big deal. You're always so busy with work. We didn't want to pressure you. My jaw clenched. I am family mom. Yes, but you travel, you work long hours, and these things get complicated. You understand, right? The words twisted inside me. I didn't understand, but I knew better than to say that out loud. Silence hung heavy until she asked, You're not mad, are you? I closed my eyes. I don't even know what I am. Another pause, longer this time. Then she said quietly, We thought it would be easier this way. Less pressure on everyone. Easier. The word stung more than anything else. Not forgotten, just erased, because I was the easy one to erase. I pulled the phone from my ear and stared at the screen, the call still connected, her voice muffled in the distance. Finally, I whispered, I need to go. All right, sweetheart, she said, as if everything was perfectly fine. I ended the call and set the phone down, my hands trembling. The apartment lights blinked softly, the little tree glowing in the corner. My chest ached, but beneath the hurt was something steadier, sharper. I sat there for a long while, listening to the hum of the heater, letting the silence say what words could not. I turned off the lamp in the living room and walked into the kitchen because I needed something to do with my hands. The counters were clean, the sink empty, and the silence pressed in so tightly I felt like I might break it just by breathing too loud. I reached for my phone again. I told myself I would not, that I should just go to bed and let it go, but the need to hear her voice, even if it hurt, was stronger. I tapped her name before I could change my mind. She answered almost right away, cheerful in that practiced tone that sounded the same whether she was speaking to the pastor or the woman at the post office. Hi, honey, she said, everything all right? I steadied my voice and asked why I had to hear from Jenny that there was a Christmas party at the house. I wanted to hear her say it out loud. There was a pause and then the soft laugh she always used to soften sharp edges. Oh, Claire, it was nothing big, just a little gathering. We knew you would be busy, and I did not want you to feel pressured. That word again, busy. I felt heat rise to my face. I said, I am your daughter, not a client you are trying to schedule. She let out a breath that sounded like a sigh, but also like dismissal. Do not be dramatic, she said. We thought it would be easier for everyone. I pressed my palm hard into the counter. Easier for who? She did not answer that. Instead, she told me Maddie had decorated the tree beautifully, that the house looked so cozy that the neighbors had dropped by. Every detail was a stitch tightening around me, making it clearer that my absence had not left even a wrinkle in the fabric. Let me talk to Dad, I said. There was a shuffle, the sound of the phone being passed, and then my father's voice, low and distracted. Hey kiddo, how are you holding up? I asked if he knew about the party. He hesitated, then said, Yes, of course your mom thought it might be best to keep it small. I asked why I had not been told. He stumbled over his words, saying something about how they figured I would be tired from work, that I would not want to drive out in the snow. I could hear the television in the background muffled sports commentary, and I knew his eyes were glued to the screen even while he spoke. "It is not about driving or snow," I said. "It is about not being wanted." He went quiet, then cleared his throat. "We are sorry if your feelings were hurt. If." The smallest word, but it carried the weight of a dismissal I knew too well. I swallowed hard. "Thanks for being honest," I said finally. "I will let you go." He tried to end it kindly. Said they loved me, but the words sounded like something read from a card. I hung up first. The kitchen light felt too bright, so I switched it off and stood in the half-dark. My reflection in the window looked tired, the outline of someone who had given too much for too long. I walked back into the living room and sat down with the notebook I kept in the drawer under the coffee table. It usually held grocery lists and reminders, but I opened to a clean page and wrote the date. Mortgage. I wrote the number due each month, 1,800. Utilities. Prescription, refills. Tuition for Maddie's spring semester due in a few weeks. Each line sat neatly on the page, harmless in ink, heavy in truth. My pen hovered over the paper as I thought about the years behind those numbers. The nights I stayed late at Bay Street Partners balancing accounts for clients, then turned around and balanced my parents too. The mornings I wired money before I even paid my own rent. The times I told myself it was temporary. I shut the notebook and slid it back into the drawer. I was not ready to decide anything yet, but seeing it written made the shape of my life too clear to ignore. I sat there until the apartment seemed to hum with it, until the little tree lights blurred. When I finally lay down, I left the lamp on. Sleep was thin, broken by dreams of crowded rooms where my chair had been pulled away. I woke before dawn, the window rimmed with frost. I made coffee and stood barefoot at the glass, watching the first flakes drift down soft and slow. The city was still waiting. I thought about calling my mother again, demanding an apology, begging for recognition. Instead, I let the phone stay face down on the counter. The heater clicked on and filled the silence, steady and warm. I wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and told myself the truth. It was not that they forgot me. It was that they had decided life was easier without me. That thought sat heavy but also sharp, like a stone I could finally see in daylight. I stayed at the window, letting the gray morning settle, and waited for the day to begin. I pulled the notebook back out later that morning because the words I had written the night before would not leave me alone. The page looked ordinary, neat black ink on white paper, but my stomach turned as I read it again. Mortgage, utilities, prescription, tuition. 4 lines that told the story of who I had been for 7 years, the quiet backbone no one ever mentioned at the dinner table. The first line was the mortgage. 1,800 every month since 2016. I had agreed to help after Dad retired early, thinking it would be for a little while. My promotion at Bay Street Partners had come with a raise, and I told myself I could handle it. Then the months stacked up, and soon I was the one keeping the roof over their heads while Mom spoke about how carefully they budgeted. The second line was utilities. At first it was just when they fell behind, when a bill slipped through the cracks. Then it became habit. I paid them quietly online before the late notices could pile up on the counter. They never asked me directly, and I never said no. It was easier that way, I told myself, though now I wondered who exactly it had been easier for. The third line was Mom's prescriptions. She had been diagnosed with high blood pressure a few years back, and I started setting the pharmacy account to my card so she would not have to think about it. She thanked me once in passing, as if I had grabbed an extra loaf of bread from the store. The last line was Maddie's tuition. 25,000 tucked away into an account that had my name on it but hers in spirit. I had promised Dad before he left his job that Maddie would never have to drop out because of money. She was my baby sister, 7 years younger, and I had felt responsible since the day she was born. I still remembered holding her as a teenager, rocking her to sleep while Mom washed dishes. She had grown up thinking the money came from our parents. Maybe she still did. I closed the notebook again and sat back staring at the small blinking tree in the corner. The ornaments caught the light in tiny flashes. None of them had my name on them. Every December we had used the same box of decorations, and Mom always picked which went where. Maddie got the angel dad put up the glass globe from his first trip to Chicago. I was given whatever was left, usually a paper star from grade school. I ran a hand through my hair and stood up. The apartment felt too quiet, so I turned on the radio, but even the soft music could not cover the gnawing thought. I had been financing their life while they edited me out of it. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside, the cold sharp against my face. The sidewalks were slick with the thin layer of snow from earlier, and I kept my head down as I walked toward the cafe on the corner. Inside, the windows fogged from the heat, and the smell of roasted beans wrapped around me like a blanket. I ordered a black coffee and found a small table by the window. I opened my phone and scrolled through old transfers, line after line of deposits into my parents' account. The numbers were steady, consistent, like rent on a house I did not live in. I closed the banking app before my chest could tighten further. A group of students sat behind me, laughing about canceled flights and holiday plans. Their joy grated against the heavy stone inside me. I sipped the coffee bitter and hot, and tried to swallow more than just the liquid. When I got back home, I opened the closet and pulled down an old shoebox I had not touched in years. Inside were pay stubs, notes I had written to myself when I first started at Bay Street. I had tucked away receipts of the first checks I sent home, believing someday it would matter to have proof. Looking at them now felt like holding relics from a life I had built with invisible bricks. I spread the papers across the table, each one a reminder of how far I had gone to keep them afloat. My friends never knew. Even Julia, who had stood beside me through heartbreak and layoffs, only suspected I helped once in a while. I had worn the label of the strong one so long it had become armor-heavy but necessary. The phone buzzed. A text from Maddie. Just a photo of her and two friends in Santa hats, mugs of cocoa in their hands. No caption, no acknowledgement that I had not been at the party. She looked happy, and for a second I almost smiled. Then the sharp truth returned. That photo had been taken in the house I paid for, under the roof my checks had secured. I placed the phone face down again. My body felt restless, so I started cleaning. Wiping counters, folding laundry, reorganizing the bookshelves. None of it silenced the truth I had finally written in that notebook. As the day slipped into evening, I sat again at the table, the shoebox still open, the papers stacked neatly now. I ran my hand over them one last time before tucking them away. My chest ached, but there was something else stirring under the ache, something sharper and more certain. I made a simple dinner, scrambled eggs and toast, and ate without tasting it. Outside, the streetlights flicked on, shining against the snowbanks. I poured myself a glass of water, sat back down, and stared at the closed drawer that held the notebook. For years I had told myself that family meant sacrifice, that holding everyone else together was the role I was meant to play. But now the pattern was clear, written in black and white. Sacrifice had become expectation. Presence had become optional. I rested my elbows on the table, folded my hands, and closed my eyes. The weight of the list pressed against me, not just as numbers, but as choices I had made. And choices I realized could change. The heater kicked on again, warm air filling the apartment. I let the sound carry me for a while, steady and familiar, until I could breathe without the tightness. The day had passed, but the knowledge remained. I had carried them for years, and they had decided life was easier without me. I looked once more at the window, the city lights glowing beyond the glass, and let the truth settle. My life was no longer bound to those lines in my notebook, not unless I chose it to be. The next morning, I sat at my desk at Bay Street Partners, staring at the spreadsheets glowing on my screen, and realized I could barely remember how I got there. The office smelled faintly of cinnamon candles someone from HR had placed near the reception, and the windows looked out over a Boston skyline wrapped in pale winter light. People moved around me with that restless energy of the last work week before Christmas, voices low, but quick coats draped over chairs, travel plans whispered across cubicles. My inbox was stacked with year-end reports, but my mind kept slipping back to the list in my notebook. Mortgage, tuition. All the quiet ways I had been financing lives that had no space for me at the table. I closed the spreadsheet and rubbed my eyes, telling myself to focus. A knock on the frame of my cubicle startled me. It was Richard, my boss, holding a mug of coffee and smiling the way managers did when they wanted to soften bad news. He asked how I was holding up and said he hoped I was planning to take a break. I nodded, though I had not told anyone my plans. He leaned against the wall and said he wanted me fresh in January, that I had earned real rest. I forced a smile and said I was thinking about getting out of town. He told me to go enjoy it, whatever it was, and that the office could survive without me. After he left, I sat there staring at the numbers on my monitor, and something inside me loosened. At work, people noticed when I carried weight. At home, no one even admitted I carried anything. The contrast felt sharp enough to sting. At lunch, I stepped out with Julia. We met at a deli near Copley Square, the kind with crowded tables and soup steaming in styrofoam cups. She hugged me tight before we Saturday. She asked about my weekend, and I told her piece by piece about the party I had not known, about the call with my mother, the list I had written. Her eyes softened, but she did not interrupt. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said I had been the strong one too long, that being strong should not mean being erased. She asked what I wanted to do next. The question sat between us like a puzzle. I told her I did not know, but I could not keep playing the same part. She nodded, then smiled a little, reminding me that sometimes distance is the only thing that clears the picture. That night back in my apartment, I opened my laptop and typed in flight searches. I did not want Florida beaches or ski slopes in Vermont. My eyes kept drifting to Paris. I remembered the photographs I had seen, streets strung with lights, the river glowing at night, cafes warm with people lingering over coffee. Something about it felt like freedom, like the opposite of being erased. I stared at the price on the screen, felt the tug in my chest, then closed the laptop. I told myself it was silly, then I opened it again. The seat map showed rows of empty spots like it was waiting for me. My fingers hovered, and then I clicked purchase before doubt could gather. I sat back, heart racing, staring at the confirmation number. Paris. I was going to Paris for Christmas. No explanations, no invitations, no need to fit into anyone's script. I walked to the window and looked down at the street where snow was piled against the curbs. A couple hurried past, scarves pulled tight, shopping bags swinging. Inside, the heater hummed steady and warm. I let the quiet sink in. Later, I pulled out my suitcase from the closet and set it on the bed. The zipper rasped open and the sound filled the small apartment. I folded sweaters, tucked in jeans, wrapped my winter coat in tissue. I slipped my passport into the side pocket and stood there staring at it. The sight of it made the trip feel real, not just a thought. I left the suitcase half-packed and went to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. My phone buzzed on the table. A group text from the family, photos of Maddie in a red scarf, my parents smiling by the tree I had helped buy 2 years ago. I scrolled without replying, each image a reminder of how easily they smiled without me. I set the phone back down face first. That night I wrote a note on a sticky pad and pressed it to the fridge. Gone for a while. Do not wait up. It looked too small for all that it meant, but it was enough. Sleep came quickly, as if my body finally understood I was not carrying their weight for once. When I woke the next morning, the sun was pale over the city. I brewed coffee and sat on the couch, the suitcase waiting by the door. My calendar was empty, no reminders set, no dinner plans or obligations. For the first time in years, the days ahead belonged only to me. I walked to the window, mug warm in my hands, and let the thought settle. I was leaving behind the roles I had never agreed to, even if just for a little while. The streets below were coated in ice cars creeping cautiously. I watched them until the mug was empty, and then I set it down. The suitcase stood like a promise in the corner of the room, and I let myself breathe in the shape of that promise without rushing. The day stretched open, quiet and steady, and for once the quiet belonged to me. The plane touched down at Charles de Gaulle just after dawn, the windows fogged with the breath of tired travelers. My legs ached from sitting too long, and my throat felt raw from the dry air, but my chest buzzed with something I had not felt in years. Possibility. I followed the crowd through customs, collected my small suitcase, and stepped into air that smelled faintly of fuel and cold stone. The cab ride into the city wound past gray suburbs, then suddenly opened into streets strung with lights bridges crossing the Seine like quiet arches. The driver spoke little English, but he nodded when I said Montmartre and pointed out the glow of Sacré-Cœur rising above the rooftops. My hotel was tucked on a narrow street lined with bakeries and cafes. The lobby smelled of butter and coffee, and the clerk handed me a brass key instead of a card. In my room, I opened the window to a slice of Paris morning. The rooftops were dusted white chimneys, sending up thin smoke. Down below, a woman in a long coat carried a baguette under her arm. I set my suitcase on the bed and let the sounds drift in. Church bells, a bus braking, someone laughing too loudly on the corner. Hunger pushed me back outside. I slipped into a cafe with fogged windows and the scent of espresso thick in the air. The waiter placed a tiny cup in front of me and I wrapped both hands around it. The first sip was sharp, strong, nothing like the paper cups back in Boston. I ordered a croissant and the flake of pastry broke across my tongue with a buttery sweetness that made me close my eyes. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of the table. Just the coffee, the pastry, and the edge of the window, where a blur of street stretched beyond. No caption. No explanation. I tapped post and set the phone aside. By the time I finished eating, the notification list had already lit up. My mother's name. Maddie's. A handful of extended relatives I had not spoken to in years. None of them sent a message, but I could feel their eyes pressing against the silence I had left. I paid my bill in euros that felt strange in my palm and walked until my feet hurt. I wandered past shop windows full of ornaments, past bookstores spilling warm light onto the sidewalk, past couples holding hands under umbrellas. The city moved around me like a current, and for once, I let it carry me instead of swimming against it. That evening, I stood at the railing of Pont Neuf, the river black and glossy under the lights. Boats passed with music drifting from their decks, and the air smelled of roasted chestnuts from a vendor nearby. I pulled my coat tighter and thought about the party at home, the one I had not been invited to. I imagined my mother pouring wine, my father settling into his chair, Maddie laughing in her red scarf. I imagined the chairs filled, the table crowded, and the empty space where I would have been. Then I thought of this bridge, this river, this city, and I felt the quiet inside me shift. Back at the hotel, I took a hot shower that steamed the tiny bathroom mirror. I slipped into bed with the window cracked open, listening to the hum of the street below. Sleep came deep and sudden. The next morning I walked down to the corner bakery. The man behind the counter smiled and handed me a warm baguette wrapped in paper. I ate it slowly while wandering the cobblestones, crumbs catching in my scarf. A small market had sprung up in the square stalls of cheese and olives, and scarves in every color. I bought a handful of mandarins and carried them back in a cloth bag, feeling almost local. I stopped at a cafe near the hilltop and ordered another small cup of coffee. This time, I lifted the phone again, framing my hand against the chipped ceramic mug with the frozen rooftops spread behind it. The polish on my fingernails was Chip the Sky Lavender. No filter, no caption. I posted it and set the phone face down. 10 minutes later, the names appeared. My mother, Maddie. 2 of Maddie's friends I had not spoken to since her graduation. They saw it, but no one said a word. Still, I could feel the difference. The silence was no longer absence. It was presence withheld. I imagined them at the kitchen table, sliding their phones beside their plates, glancing at the screen between bites of leftovers. I pictured my mother pressing her lips together, Maddie's eyes narrowing. I wondered if they felt the hollow where I had been, if they noticed the gap now that I was not filling it. I tucked the phone away and stayed at the cafe until the light faded. The bells of Sacré-Cœur rang across the rooftops, deep and slow. I wrapped my scarf tighter and walked back toward the hotel, the city glowing with strings of white light. In my room, I opened my journal. I wrote nothing poetic, just lists. Things I did not have to do here. No small talk. No pretending I was fine. No RSVP. No gift registry, only me and the sound of a city moving around me. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked at the small window. The glass reflected my face and the thin line of lights beyond. My chest felt heavy, but it was a different kind of heavy. Not the weight of obligation, but the weight of being finally alone with myself. I climbed into bed, pulled the blanket over my shoulders, and let the hum of the heater mix with the faint laughter from the street below. The night stretched quiet, and for once I did not push against it. I let it hold me. The morning broke gray and damp, a drizzle softening the rooftops outside my window. I wrapped myself in a sweater and padded down to the lobby, where the smell of fresh bread floated in from the bakery next door. I carried a small croissant and coffee back up to my room, set them on the desk, and powered on my phone out of habit. The first thing I saw was a string of missed calls from my mother's number. A few from my father. One from Maddie. My chest tightened, but I told myself it was nothing, maybe just holiday greetings spilling late. I scrolled further and saw the email notifications. My stomach sank as soon as I read the subject line. Bay State Mortgage. Payment reminder. The message was polite, mechanical. The December payment had not been received. A red notice would be mailed to the property address. I stared at the words until the letters blurred. For years that payment had come from my account like clockwork. I had never missed once. This time I had not scheduled it. This time I had let the silence answer for me. The phone buzzed again while I sat there, the sound sharp in the small room. A voicemail popped up. I pressed play before I could stop myself. My father's voice filled the space, rough and halting. He said the bank had called the house, that an official notice might arrive any day, and asked if I could check my end. He sounded embarrassed, his voice dropping lower like he hoped no one else would hear. I closed my eyes and listened to the scrape of his chair in the background, the familiar sound of him shifting at the kitchen table. I could picture it so clearly, him leaning on the wood grain worn from decades of dinners, staring at the bills lined up in front of him. I set the phone down and tried to focus on the coffee, but it had gone cold. I poured it into the sink and watched the swirl circle the drain. By afternoon, the drizzle had turned to steady rain. I walked along the narrow streets with my hood up, the stones slick under my boots. The shops were still bright with Christmas decorations, but I kept seeing that subject line in my head, the way the words were phrased with such clinical distance. Past due, immediate attention required. I ducked into a cafe to warm up. The waiter brought me a café crème, and I cupped it between my palms. My phone buzzed again. Another voicemail, this time from my mother. Her voice was steady but clipped. She asked if I had forgotten the payment, said it must have slipped through the cracks, then added that the bank had sounded concerned. I heard a tightness in her tone I recognized. Fear dressed as control. I placed the phone face down on the table and stared at the foam on the coffee. Around me, people chatted in French, their voices rising and falling like a song I could not follow. I breathed slowly, telling myself I had done nothing wrong. I had paid for years without being asked, and no one had thanked me. Now, silence had spoken louder than words. When I returned to the hotel that evening, the front desk clerk handed me a small slip. A message had come through the lobby phone for me. It was from Julia. She said she had tried my cell and wanted to make sure I was okay. I carried the note upstairs and called her back. Her voice was warm, a thread pulling me home. She asked how Paris was. I told her it was beautiful, that the lights looked like they floated on the river at night, but then my words trailed off. She asked what was wrong, and I told her about the mortgage email, about the calls piling up, about the silence I had chosen, and how it was finally being noticed. Julia let the line stay quiet for a moment. Then she said what I needed to hear, that it was not my responsibility to keep bailing them out. That silence did not mean cruelty, it meant boundaries. She reminded me that they had decided I was easier to erase, and now they were learning what that actually cost. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the phone to my ear, tears prickling behind my eyes. Her words did not erase the ache, but they steadied me. After we hung up, I stood at the window. The rain had eased and the city glittered wet under the street lamps. I pulled the curtain closed and lay down, but my phone kept buzzing against the nightstand. I turned it off. The room fell quiet, except for the hum of the heater. I breathed deeply, letting the silence fill me instead of empty me. Somewhere across the ocean, the first letter from the bank was sliding into my parents' mailbox. Somewhere, my absence was no longer invisible. I pressed my palm against the blanket and let the thought rest there heavy but true as the city outside settled into night. The next morning, I walked down to the corner bakery and bought a baguette wrapped in brown paper. The air outside was sharp with cold, the kind that pinched your nose and made every sound seem closer. I carried the bread back to my room and tore off a piece while the television murmured in French. I was only half listening until the phone buzzed again. There were 5 missed calls, all from home. I ignored them at first, then one voicemail notification caught my eye. It was short, less than 30 seconds, which I knew meant panic. I pressed play. My father's voice was shaky. He said a letter had been nailed to the front door. He used the word foreclosure, the word I had been waiting to hear. He stammered through the details that the neighbors had already seen it, that people on the block were talking. His breath hitched as he asked me to call back to explain, to fix it the way I always did. I set the phone on the desk and stared at it. My hands trembled slightly, not with fear but with recognition. This was the silence turning into consequence. I made coffee with the small kettle in the room and sat at the window while the city stirred awake. Down on the street, a man was sweeping snow away from his doorway. A child pulled on her mother's arm, begging for a pastry from the shop across the corner. Life moved forward, indifferent to my family's unraveling. By midday, I stepped outside. The clouds hung low, but the streets were alive with vendors setting up stalls for the new year. I wandered through them, picking up small jars of jam, scarves, postcards. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Maddie. She wrote, "Did you know about this? Did you know the bank was going to do this to us?" I stood in the middle of the square, staring at the words. I typed back, "I did not do this to you. I stopped doing it for you." Then I deleted the message before sending. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. When I returned to the hotel, there was another voicemail waiting. My mother's voice, sharp with humiliation, saying the neighbors were already whispering. She said Mrs. Parker from next door had seen the notice and told the ladies at church. My mother's tone cracked between anger and desperation. She said, "We cannot have this kind of shame, Claire." She told me to call immediately, that this was bigger than me being upset. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Bigger than me being upset. I thought of the years of payments that had never been acknowledged, the invisible scaffolding I had provided, and now the shame was bigger than my pain. I opened my journal and wrote 3 words. I stopped paying. Seeing them on paper steadied me. That evening I walked to the Seine. The water reflected the lights of the bridge's ripples, carrying color across the dark. I leaned against the railing and breathed deeply, letting the cold sting my lungs. My phone buzzed again. I pulled it out and saw a text from Julia. She wrote, "Your mom called me." She sounded frantic. "Are you all right?" I typed back, "I am fine." "They are not." Then I added, "I cannot keep holding it all." Julia replied quickly, "You should not. Let them face it." I put the phone away and stayed at the river until my fingers went numb. Around me, couples strolled with scarves tucked tight. Tourists took pictures of the towers glowing in the distance. I felt both small and solid, a part of the city's pulse, but anchored in my own stillness. Back in my room, I heated the baguette in the oven until it crisped again. I ate it with jam and poured myself a glass of water. The voicemails kept stacking, each one shorter and more urgent, like their words were running out. I did not press play. I pulled the curtains closed and sat on the bed with the blanket wrapped around my shoulders. Somewhere back in Massachusetts, a white paper was nailed to the door of the house I had kept standing. Somewhere neighbors were whispering about the Bennett family and their oldest daughter, who had always seemed absent. I rested my head against the wall and let the hum of the heater fill the silence. For the first time in years, I felt the balance tilt. The burden was no longer mine to carry, and the sound of it slipping from my shoulders was quieter than I expected. The next morning I woke to a pale light seeping through the curtains and the muffled sound of church bells carrying across the rooftops. My phone was heavy with missed calls again, but one message caught my attention. It was from Maddie. She wrote, "They are saying my classes might get cancelled. Did you stop paying?" I read the words 3 times, my chest tightening. I sat on the edge of the bed, feet pressed to the cold floor, staring at the screen. I wanted to remind her of all the deposits I had made, the hours I had worked overtime, so her tuition check never bounced the times I skipped vacations to make sure her books were covered. But my fingers hovered without typing. Instead, I set the phone down and stood by the window. Down below, shopkeepers were unlocking doors, children bundled in scarves, tugging at parents' arms. Life outside was moving forward while inside me the past 7 years pressed like a weight I could no longer lift. The phone buzzed again. This time Maddie's voice filled the room through voicemail. She was crying, words tumbling out, accusing and pleading all at once. She said she did not understand that she had finals coming, that the university office had called, and said her account was overdue. She said she thought our parents were handling it. She said she thought I only helped sometimes. Then her voice cracked into silence before she whispered, "Please, Claire, I need you." I sat down hard on the chair, the sound of her voice circling me. She was 27, old enough to know how the world worked, but still clinging to the idea that someone else would carry the load. I thought back to the night I had stayed on the phone with her through her first panic attack, the way she had called me after her first heartbreak. I had always picked up, always. But this time my hands stayed still. I did not press call back. I needed air, so I grabbed my coat and walked until the streets narrowed into a small square where vendors sold cheese and fruit. I bought an apple and ate it slowly, the crisp sweetness grounding me. My phone buzzed in my pocket again and I let it ring. By afternoon, I returned to the hotel only to find 3 more voicemails waiting. One from Maddie again this time, sharper, accusing me of abandoning her. One from my mother, her tone brittle, saying the family name was being dragged through the mud. And one from my father, quieter than I had ever heard him, saying he did not know how to fix things. I poured a glass of water and sat at the desk staring at the phone. My mind wandered back to the promise I had made to myself as a teenager, rocking Maddie to sleep while Mom scrubbed dishes. I had vowed she would never feel alone. But here I was continents away, choosing silence. The guilt twisted sharp, but alongside it came a strange calm. For years I had been the scaffolding holding them all up. Now that scaffolding had been removed, and they were forced to see what it cost to ignore the one who carried it. I opened my journal and wrote down the words Maddie had said in her message. "Please, Claire, I need you." I underlined them once, then set the pen down. The page stared back at me, both a wound and a mirror. That evening, I walked to the banks of the Seine. The water moved slow under the lights, the current steady and sure. I leaned against the stone wall and let the cold sink into me. Around me, people strolled, couples, laughing tourists, snapping photos, children running with mittens swinging. None of them knew the weight of the word easy, the way it could erase someone without leaving a mark. I pulled my phone out once more. Another text from Maddie had arrived. She wrote, "I cannot do this without you. Classes will drop me if the payment is not made." My thumb hovered over the screen, the reflex to protect rising like muscle memory. I closed my eyes, then slid the phone back into my pocket. The river kept moving, and so did I, walking, until the lights blurred into one long line behind me. Back in the hotel, I lay on the bed with my coat still on, staring at the ceiling. The heater hummed, the city murmured outside, and inside me the ache and the calm tangled together. I let them sit side by side, knowing this was only the beginning of what silence would reveal. The following day, I woke to a different kind of silence. Not the soft stillness of Paris mornings, but the kind that settles in your stomach before a storm. I made coffee in the little kettle, opened my phone, and saw a new flood of messages. The first was from Aunt Carol. She wrote that she was sorry to hear what was happening, that people at church were whispering, that she had no idea I had been paying for so long. My hand went cold as I read it. The second message was a screenshot forwarded from a neighbor back home. It was an official letter from Bay State Mortgage with my name clearly listed as the primary payer. The paper was stamped in bold with the words delinquent account. The image was blurry, but it was enough. Proof had slipped into the world. I stared at it for a long time, my breath shallow. For years, my role had been hidden, invisible scaffolding behind the family's polished front. Now the paperwork made it undeniable. Anyone who saw that page would know exactly who had been carrying the weight. By mid-morning, the calls started again. I silenced them one after another until one voicemail came through from Maddie. Her voice was raw, not from tears this time, but from something harsher. She said she had been blindsided when a financial officer at Columbia told her the account holder listed on her tuition was me. She said she had looked stupid, standing there, realizing in front of strangers that her big sister had been the one keeping her in school all these years. The anger in her words almost covered the tremor underneath, but I heard it anyway. I sat at the desk, notebook open, and let her words replay in my mind. She had not thanked me. She had not apologized. She had only said she felt humiliated that the truth had come out. I underlined the word humiliated in my journal and circled it twice. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk near the Louvre. The glass pyramids sparkled against the winter sky tourists, crowding the square, snapping photos. I watched them while my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. When I finally looked, there was a message from Julia. She had been contacted by my mother, who had confessed that the neighbors were saying my name. Julia told me gently that the truth was spreading fast, that I should be prepared. I sat on a stone bench, the cold seeping through my jeans, and let the weight of that settle. For years I had lived in the shadow of my family's narrative, the easy one to erase. Now the shadow was gone. The light of truth was harsh, but it was honest. That evening, back at the hotel, I ordered soup from the kitchen and sat by the window with the bowl steaming in my hands. The voicemails kept coming. My father's voice brittle with shame, saying people at the hardware store had asked him if it was true. My mother's tone frantic and clipped, blaming me for letting it leak out. She said dignity was hard to earn back once it was lost. She said I had ruined their reputation. I set the phone down and whispered to the empty room. No, I just stopped covering it. Outside Paris glowed with winter lights. A couple kissed at the corner, their laughter carrying up to my window. I pressed my forehead to the glass and felt the contrast so sharply it almost split me. Here I was invisible in the best way, just another traveler among millions, while at home my absence had become louder than my presence ever was. Before bed, I listened once more to the last voicemail from Maddie. Her voice cracked at the end. She said she did not know who else to ask for help. She said she was scared. She did not say she was sorry. I turned off the lamp, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and let the city sounds rise up through the cracks of the window. My eyes stayed open long after the soup cooled on the desk. The truth was out now, and there was no pulling it back into silence. The next morning, the phone started buzzing before I even opened my eyes. I let it ring until the screen went dark again, but then another call followed and another. I finally picked it up, not because I wanted to hear them, but because the noise had become unbearable. My mother's voice spilled through the line, sharp and trembling. She said reporters had called the house not from big papers, but from the local community blog, the kind that thrived on gossip. She said Mrs. Parker had told everyone at the church brunch that the foreclosure notice had my name on it, that I had been the one paying the mortgage all these years. Her words came in gasps, not from sadness, but from fury. She said I had humiliated them in front of their friends. I kept the phone at my ear but said nothing. My silence stretched so long that she finally asked if I was still there. I said yes quietly, then set the phone on the desk so her voice became muffled noise in the background. When she finally hung up, another voicemail notification appeared. This one from Maddie. Her voice was raw, almost unrecognizable. She said the university office had frozen her account until the overdue tuition was paid. She said she was going to lose her classes, maybe her housing. She begged me to call back, begged me to fix it like I always had. At the end, her voice broke into sobs. I sat on the bed staring at the window where frost clung to the edges of the glass. The city outside was waking up buses, rumbling vendors opening their shops, but inside me everything was still. For years they had counted on me to fill the silence with solutions. Now the silence was theirs to face. By midday I walked to a cafe near the river and ordered a coffee. I sat outside even though the air was cold enough to sting my skin. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. His voicemail was different. His tone was low and tired, like he had aged in a matter of days. He said he did not know how things had gotten this far. That he had trusted Mom to manage, that he thought Maddie would be more responsible by now. Then he said words I had never heard from him before. He said they needed me home. I put the phone in my pocket and stared at the steam rising from my cup. The idea of being needed sounded strange, now hollow. They had not needed me when they excluded me from Christmas. They had not needed me when they laughed about how busy I was. They only needed me when the scaffolding was gone and the house was shaking. I stayed there for hours, watching the light fade from gray to gold, the city moving around me. At one point, I pulled out my journal and wrote down his words. "We need you home." I underlined them once, then closed the book. That night, I walked through the streets strung with white lights. Families moved together, children pointing at window displays, couples pausing to kiss beneath the decorations. I stopped at Pont Marie, leaning on the railing, the river black and steady below. My phone buzzed again. This time I answered. Maddie's voice rushed through the line before I could say hello. She said she was desperate, that she had nowhere else to turn, that she could not believe I was ignoring her. I listened without interrupting. When she finally stopped to breathe, I asked softly, "What did you think was happening all these years?" The silence on her end was sharp. Then she said she thought Mom and Dad had saved, that maybe Dad's retirement package was bigger than she realized. She said she thought the checks just came from somewhere. I told her they came from me. Every month. Every semester. She whispered my name, but no other words came. I let the pause sit there between us. For once, it was her turn to feel the weight of it. Then I told her I had to go, and ended the call before she could speak again. Back at the hotel, I poured a glass of water and sat by the window. The city below was alive with music and laughter, but inside my room it was quiet. My phone lay on the table, the screen lighting up with another call. I turned it face down. The truth was out. They had asked for me in every possible way. And still I chose silence. I leaned back in the chair, the glass cool in my hand, and let the night close in. The heater hummed, the river moved, and somewhere across the ocean my family sat in a house that no longer belonged to them, wondering how it all had slipped away. Snow began to fall in Paris the next morning, soft flakes drifting sideways against the windows of the hotel. I stood with a mug of coffee, warming my hands, and watched the rooftops blur under white. The phone on the desk buzzed once, then again, then again. I ignored it until the screen went dark, but the silence that followed was heavier than the ringing. By noon, I walked to a cafe across from the Seine. The windows were fogged, the tables crowded, and the air smelled of butter and smoke. I ordered onion soup and sat near the corner, the bowl steaming in front of me. My phone vibrated on the table, and this time I turned it over. 6 voicemails, all from home. My stomach clenched, but I pressed play anyway. The first was my mother's voice, thinner than usual. She said the bank had scheduled a final inspection, that the locks might be changed before the end of the month. She said she could not show her face at church. Her words cracked once, then she swallowed it down and ended the call without goodbye. The second voicemail was my father. He sounded older, like the weight of every year had caught up to him in a week. He said the hardware store customers avoided his eyes now that he wished things had been different. He did not ask me to call back. He just said he was sorry, then the line clicked dead. The third was Maddie. Her voice carried a fury that only comes from fear. She shouted that her tuition account was frozen, that she had begged the financial office for more time, that she could not believe I had done this to her. Then her voice broke, and she whispered, "Please, I do not know what to do." I let the rest play in the background, their voices overlapping in my head, each one desperate in its own way. The soup cooled as I listened. I lifted the spoon once, set it back down, and finally pushed the bowl aside. The cafe door opened, and a rush of cold air swept through. I watched strangers bundle their coats tighter, stamping snow from their boots, moving on with their day. I sat still, anchored in a storm of words that no longer belonged to me. That evening I returned to the hotel and turned on the small lamp by the bed. My journal lay open where I had left it. I picked up the pen and wrote one line. They are unraveling. I set the pen down and stared at the page, the ink shining wet in the light. Later, while I was brushing my teeth, the phone buzzed again. This time it was not a call but a text from Aunt Carol. She wrote, "Your mother is asking for you. She has not left her room. She keeps saying your name." I rinsed my mouth, wiped the steam from the mirror, and stared at my reflection. My eyes looked tired, but behind them was something steadier than before. I put the phone on the nightstand and climbed into bed. The next morning, I woke to another message, this time from my father's sister, the one who had once told me after Dad died that older daughters were like extra mothers. She wrote, "She is asking for you. Just 5 minutes, Claire." I sat on the edge of the bed, the blanket pooled at my waist, and read it twice. My hands trembled, not with the urge to rush to them, but with the ache of recognition. They had missed not me, but what I did for them. Now, with everything collapsing, they wanted the scaffolding back. I made tea and carried it to the window. The city below was pale with snow, the river dark against the white banks. My phone buzzed again and again on the table. I let it. By evening, the calls slowed. The voicemail softened, the edges frayed. My mother's voice cracked more than once, my father's grew quieter. Maddie's slipped from anger into pleading. I listened to none of them fully, just enough to know the tone. I stood at the window as the sky turned lavender over Paris. The heater hummed in the corner. My tea had gone cold. Their voices pressed against the glass between us, but the glass held. For the first time, I let it hold. The morning sun broke clear, for the first time, in days, stretching across the rooftops and catching on the snow that still clung to the chimneys. I boiled water in the little kettle and poured it over a tea bag, then carried the cup to the desk where my stationery lay. The thick, cream-colored paper had been sitting in the bottom of my suitcase since I left Boston. I had packed it without a plan, but now I knew why. I smoothed the sheet flat and held the pen above it. For a moment, my mind wandered back to the house in Worcester, the kitchen where I had once spent hours balancing their bills while the smell of roast chicken filled the air. The phone pressed between my shoulder and ear as I reassured Maddie and about exams. That kitchen now held foreclosure notices and arguments whispered through closed doors. My name was no longer a secret, but a wound everyone could see. I lowered the pen and wrote in small, steady letters, "I hope you find peace. I hope you tell the truth. I hope next time the invitation comes before the apology." I signed it with my full name. Just Claire Bennett, nothing more. I folded the page carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it. No return address. Later, I walked into town, the cold biting my cheeks, and found a red postbox near a bakery where the air smelled of cardamom and butter. I slid the letter through the slot and listened for the hollow drop inside. My fingers lingered on the metal edge before I pulled them away. On the walk back, I stopped at the lagoon. A single bench faced the water, half covered in snow. I sat there with a paper cup of coffee steam rising into the air and watched the slow ripple of the current. My phone stayed in my pocket. I did not need to check it. I knew the messages would still be there, a pile of unanswered words waiting across the ocean. That night, I lit the small candle I had bought from a market stall, its wax carrying the faint scent of pine. I heated soup, tore bread, and settled under a blanket with a book I had picked up from a second-hand shop. I read the same page 3 times, not because I was distracted, but because I did not want to rush. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt earned. Before bed, I opened my journal one last time and wrote, "I am not erased." I closed it, placed it on the nightstand, and turned off the light. The city outside murmured a low hum of life moving forward, and I let myself rest in it. Days later, I stood at Charles de Gaulle with my suitcase beside me, waiting for my flight back to Boston. The departure board flickered, people hurried past with scarves and luggage, announcements echoed overhead. I looked down at the boarding pass in my hand and felt calm. I was not going home to fix anything. I was going back because it was my life, my story, and I could choose how to carry it now. As the plane lifted into the sky, Paris spread beneath me, the river winding dark and steady, the rooftops glinting under pale winter light. I pressed my forehead to the glass and whispered a goodbye only I could hear. And now I want to ask you, have you ever been left out by the people who should have held you closest? Have you ever chosen silence and found it louder than words? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like this story if it resonated with you, and subscribe so you do not miss more journeys of family justice and the quiet strength we often forget we hold.